They say families vote on who's family all the time. They just usually don't do it with forks in their hands and laughter in their throats. We did, on purpose, on Thanksgiving, with a toast and a chant, and the kind of cheer reserved for weddings and televised competitions. My name is Daniel. People in my family used to call me Steady. They would say I was dependable, that I had a good head on my shoulders. That was code. That was how they explained giving me luggage, and not asking about the weight behind it. They took my steadiness for granted, until they decided it was too easy to exploit. Tonight, they decided I was the problem. Natalie stood up like she had a script and a stage, and a spotlight, and expected applause. She had that practiced smile they'd always praised in family photos, the smile that hid how deft she was at moving pieces, so no one saw her fingers. She said as casually as someone buying milk, "We voted. You're not family anymore." At first I thought she was joking. A terrible, cruel joke. The silverware stopped. The gravy boat trembled. Someone clapped. Not in outrage, in appalling celebration. Uncle Mitch raised his glass. Cousin Laura snapped like someone at a concert. My mother laughed the laugh of someone who believes she's telling the truth while she's sharpening the barbs. The air in the dining room went thin. The way air goes thin right before a storm. I sat there because I wanted to, because I was curious, because I had a quiet plan. I slid my plate aside with the same calm I'd used to pay their heating bills, the same calm I'd used to count the zeros on transfers and the receipts I'd kept in a shoebox in my closet. "You rehearsed this," I said. My voice was small but steady. I pulled a folder from my bag. It thunked onto the table like a gavel. The noise made heads turn too loud, too clean in the murmur of their celebration. "What is that?" Natalie asked, and the artifice dropped for a second, leaving a sliver of annoyance that looked like a crack in a well-polished statue. "Open it," I said. She ripped it. She expected gossip, a rumor, an accusation that could be shrugged off with charm and tears. Her face read the first page, and then lost color. The pages multiplied in her hands. Bank transfers, screenshots of messages, receipts with timestamps, a timeline that mapped out my generosity in black and white. I had everything in there. Every favor that had become an expectation. Every "can you just help" that turned into a new foot in the door. She screamed, not the theatrical gasp she'd used to get out of homework as a child, not a sharp intake that got attention. It was a raw sound that split the room open and left us all listening to the echo. Chairs scraped. The folder slammed like a body onto the oak table. "Monster," she said through the scream. "How dare you? You had no right." There was fury but also a franticness, like someone watching their illusions burn. Joel grabbed the folder and scanned. He turned slowly toward me. "Is this?" he asked. "Yes," I said. I had thought 1,000 ways that moment might go. I hadn't thought the quiet, terrible satisfaction of being understood by facts might feel like the only mercy left. They had always had explanations for everything. We were stressed. It was an emergency. "You're lucky to have us, but luck is a poor substitute when it's a habit you pay for, without being asked." My folder laid out 5 years of that habit. $78,000, not a single repayment plan, no acknowledgement, nothing but mockery and invitation. I watched my mother who had once kissed my scraped knees and told me to be brave, watch the pages flutter like a child who had just been told the truth about Santa. She reached for the cranberry sauce as if she could steady herself with condiment. This is a violation," she muttered. Not to me, but to the ghost of the woman she'd been. "You stood there and voted me out," I said. "You clapped so you could feel brave. You made a show, and now you want me to be quiet. After all these years you treated my quietness like a bank account. Not anymore." Natalie's arm trembled when she slammed the folder shut. Her mouth found a sharpness I'd seen before. Deflection. "You chose to help," she said. "You weren't forced. This is about control. This is about you making a show." I could have talked numbers. I'd already printed them. I could have explained each transfer like a calm mathematician, but I wasn't going to negotiate on their terms. This wasn't about origination. It was about pattern. I didn't want the version of me who pays without asking why. I wanted the version that doesn't disappear when she says no. There was something fragile in the room that had nothing to do with the turkey. Something sharp and real. Joel asked about Santa Monica. The number next to a hotel name had been the last red flag that unpeeled the rest. He read the line as if the words themselves would be a proof. "Why were you at a hotel on my card?" he said. There was no defense anymore. She didn't have the practiced deflection. She had nothing but an equal part fury and fear. My father, who had been drinking quietly, looked like a man who had taken one too many truths all at once. He tried to call it small, to minimize the thing that had just upended their certainty. "This is bigger than it is," he said. He always said that when he wanted to fold the story back into the comfortable one we all preferred. "You watched them do this to me," I said. "You heard them call me names. You let the jokes land. You used my help and then used their words to hide how small that help made you feel. You let it happen because it was easier than making waves." No one denied it, but denial is a house that collapses under its own furniture. The second someone opens the doors, she called me pathetic. She called me dramatic. A classic playbook. You do not get to be both the martyr and the abuser. You cannot wield victimhood like a shield while you bleed the pockets of the person holding your coat. I unfolded another envelope. I had been thorough. Power of attorney forms, revocations I'd filed weeks earlier, medical proxy removed, emergency contact reversed. It was legal and cold and precise, and the room tasted like something metallic. My mother's face crumpled. She reached out like a swimmer who thought a rope had appeared and then realized the ocean had taken it away. "You're revoking everything?" she asked. "Yes, I signed them. I'm done being a backstop for people who treat me like an ATM." I stood. I left without raising my voice more than I had to. The air outside tasted like the first time I'd run for hours as a kid and realized no one was chasing me. I stopped at the lake, the place that had once been my refuge. The water was a glassy thing that night, and I sat with my shirt wet with the cold and thought about freedom in small, simple ways. That night I slept for the first time in years without waiting for a message, a Venmo. The next morning the messages came as they always do. Softly, like a net cast into water hoping for a bite. Mom called. Natalie texted venom masked in pleading. Joel filed for divorce and then came back with messages that read like admissions, but not apologies. I didn't reply. I needed silence more than I needed a fight. I will tell you now how I reached that folder. How I went from small favors to the realization that I had been financing a mythology. How I kept receipts, not because I was paranoid, but because being a bank for a family is a practice of obliterating yourself. There are burns that come from giving until you burn out. There is a dull ache to discovering you bought the stage props for someone else's show. The details matter only because they show this. I did not want vengeance. I wanted boundaries. And when they chose to make me an enemy for drawing a line, I chose myself. But we're just at the beginning. People tell you generosity is a virtue. What they rarely mention is it can blur into erasure when it's never reciprocated. Generosity for us became a ledger the family wrote in my handwriting. When I was 19, I moved out with the kind of stubborn independence that felt romantic and righteous. 2 jobs, a degree, nights working until the light in the laundromat hummed me awake. I thought that meant I'd be respected for not needing anything. Instead, it made me their go-to. Need a loan? Daniel's on the line. Emergency? Daniel can handle it. It didn't take long for Can You to drift into You Will. Natalie had always been the center of their attention. She was golden, not because she had earned grace, but because she curated it. Good grades, good looks, charisma on an industrial scale. She knew which story to tell, and when to tilt her voice so that people leaned in. Because of that, her mistakes were theatrical turns that made the plot interesting. while mine were tidy, quiet, and unremarkable. No one clapped for me when I sent money for my father's dental work, even though without it he would have been in pain for months. No one posted a story about my overtime shifts. That silence accumulates. The loan for Joel's rehab arrived like an accordion. First a small sum, then an emergency, then another emergency. I remember reading one of Natalie's messages late at night. "Please, we're drowning." The subtext was always, "You can fix this. You're the only one who can." I replied with a transfer and a short message. "I've got you. Don't tell anyone." It started as kindness. It became an expectation. When their wedding came, they said it would be too much to ask for half. I paid what I could. They left for a honeymoon and posted photos with captions that looked like lines from a screenplay. Sunset smiles and captions about love, and how they'd never forget the support of family. I watched those posts and realized that my name was never in the frames. My contribution was invisible unless it fit into a performance. When I asked for something back, or even asked for a moment of respect, they retorted as if I had committed an offense. It stung most when they called me names. "You don't have a life," they'd whisper, which landed like a cut, because the quiet I lived by was not a lack, but a choice. "You're only good for money." The irony is that at the same time they said that, they were on their phones, tapping out requests. The cost of being a generous person in that house was constant erasure. So I began keeping records, not because I liked numbers, but because I wanted an accurate memory of the transactions that had been made in my name. I printed transfer confirmations, recorded dates, saved screenshots of messages where Natalie would frame my help as an indictment. They mocked me in private comments, calling me cash cow or doormat, and laughed about my supposed neediness. They thought I didn't know. They assumed that because I was quiet I would remain obedient. When I said no to the co-sign request for a supposed wellness cafe, it shifted something. That no was a pivot. The first honest sentence I had spoken aloud in years. 3 months later they staged the vote. Voting me out was the kindest cruelty they could think of. Public, performative, and with the moral high ground already polished. After the vote, I refused to be spoken for. I assembled the folder as if I were writing a book of evidence for myself. Every email asking for money, every Venmo request, accompanied by a sob story, every private comment where they ridiculed me, everything was in that folder. I created a timeline not because I wanted to punish, but because I wanted to show them their architecture of entitlement. When Joel read Santa Monica in black and white, he could no longer retreat into ignorance. He looked at Natalie as if seeing a portrait for the first time. "You were at a hotel for 3 nights on my card," he said. There were no excuses that fit the fact. He could see the dates matched receipts, and there were charges that had nothing to do with hospitalization or emergencies or anything that merited a carve-out. It was spending for comfort, for escape, for self-medication. That's not emergency. That's a lifestyle choice on someone else's dime. You should not be surprised by our reaction to exposure. People who build identities off of other people's sacrifice tend to unravel when the ledger is laid bare. Shame is cunning. So is entitlement. When you pull back the curtain, someone will step up and call you cruel for showing them what they chose not to see. They will accuse you of being a control freak because you refused to be both a wallet and a witness. There were small humiliations tied to my kindness. Once, after I covered a cousin's tuition deposit, I got a text. "Congrats, you're so generous, maybe get a life now." The hours I worked while being mocked rolled into one another like a smear on a photograph. And still, I kept giving, because at the time I thought capitulation was the price of family. The folder was not just numbers, it was receipts of my emotional labor. I'd driven Laura to the airport at dawn, bought groceries for my parents when they forgot the money was due, sat through an intervention for Joel that I financed quietly by buying plane tickets. All of it had become their shorthand for what family meant. access to me. Their idea of gratitude was entitlement. After I walked out of the dining room that night, I expected rage. I expected pleas. I expected a dozen things. They sent the silence first. That silence is a special cruelty. It's a pressure that squeezes like a hand on the throat and expects you to breathe through it. It's a vacuum that will suck at your certainty until you offer an apology to refill it. When the messages came, it was the same pattern: pity and the ask. We're selling the house, they wrote. We're underwater. We need you. Piazza has a name for people who return to destructive dynamics. Trauma bonders. Some relationships trade on the rhythm of abuse and rescue. They were asking me not for reconciliation but for reinstatement. To step back into the role where their lives could work because mine did. I didn't respond. I changed the locks on the account they had access to. I updated password. I made a life where their emergency requests were no longer my immediate reflex. I learned what happens when the firewall goes up. People try every strategy. They try charm. They fold into guilt. They weaponize nostalgia. They will send a picture of a half-decorated Christmas tree captioned, "Look what you've done." It's a special kind of manipulation, the art of turning absence into an ethical indictment. A letter came, handwritten, 3 pages, my mother's looping. Guilt, then the ask, and she begged in the language of family. It was designed like every plea confession on page 1, guilt on page 2, the ask on page 3. Sorry, they wrote, and then could you help us make it right? That was the hook. I held the letter like a thin sheet and felt how thin their contrition really was. So I did the only radical thing I could. I didn't give them the access and I didn't give them the satisfaction of my silence. I moved on. I moved cities. I got therapy. I reconnected with friends who had been exhausted by my invisibility. I stopped answering calls at midnight. I slept without the fear that my phone would light up with someone else's crisis. Freedom is not glamorous. It's dental appointments you schedule and sleep you finally get. It's a job where your line manager isn't your moral arbiter. It's the crisp, boring delight of paying bills for yourself and not worried about someone else's regret or entitlement. And then something unexpected happened. Joel sent a message that made me sit still. He had filed for divorce. My folder had done something I didn't expect. It had cracked open a truth so blunt. Joel could no longer see his own face in the mirror of their marriage. His message read like someone taking the first honest step out of a long story. He'd been told, "You did the right thing," he wrote. "I should have left sooner." That sentence landed with a weightless relief. It wasn't triumph. It was evidence that my act of showing up had consequences beyond me. Sometimes, truth makes people wake up and realize they've been complicit. But justice, I learned, is messy. People will react in stages. First silence, then pleading, then strategy, then desperation, then ugliness. They will adapt. They will find other ways to get at what they want. But this time it wasn't my job to fix their adaptation. For the first time I refused to be the glue. When you step away, you discover how loud silence can be. The first week after Thanksgiving felt like a holiday you hadn't planned. A relief that arrived without trumpets. No calls, no Venmo pings, no messages that asked for bailouts in the language of love. I woke to sunlight angling through my new apartment and realized I could breathe without rehearsed gratitude. People outside the family reacted in ways that surprised me. Friends I hadn't spoken with in years reached out to say they'd read a post somewhere about what happened. "We're proud of you," they said. Not everyone applauded, but the ones who didn't ask for money or emotional labor. They offered small things: dinner, time, a shoulder. It was a kindness I'd forgotten how to accept without the price tag of guilt. The family did what families who feel entitled do when a bank becomes unavailable. They tried the emotional markets. Mom's picture of a tree with a conspicuous void where my presence would be was a bait. The caption's thesis was not apology but guilt. "Ellie misses you. We need you." You broke the family. The message devices they used were intentional. They knew how to poke, I sat with the silence for multiple days. I let myself grind through the sensation of being unaccounted for in their economies. Then I began to rebuild the life I had neglected. I focused on work and on small pleasures. My dog, long morning runs, coffee brewed precisely so I could savor the quiet. I made dentist appointments and therapy sessions, and re-established a calendar that didn't revolve around other people's crises. Therapy taught me something else. Entitlement is an emotional tax. You will feel drained if you keep paying it. You are allowed to refuse a tax that is unpaid labor in the form of guilt. The first time I considered how it might feel to truly leave, to not be their safety net, was when a man named Mark called me from a number I didn't know. He was polite. He was trying to do the polite work a bank would do when someone's access was limited. This is when the practical consequences of my cutoff revealed themselves. They needed funds. They had been using me as a buffer. Now the buffer was gone. The consequences were messy, lived out in the quiet desperation that shows up on the phone lines. Then February arrived with a final try, a handwritten letter, 3 pages in my mother's identifiable script, arrived like it was designed to be irresistible. She wrote sorrow, she wrote guilt, she wrote the ask. She said they were selling the house and needed a small bridge loan. She wrote as if saying sorry, bought entrance back to the cupboard. I read it twice. I felt the old tug. Then I folded it and tossed it. It was the most honest thing I'd done in years, refuse the hook. I wanted to feel compassion for them, but compassion is not the same as consent. Months went by. Friends were steady. Joel's divorce finalized with terms that separated him from the illusions he'd been told. Laura, the cousin who'd clapped at the vote, texted a quiet apology about tuition. Little admissions began to surface when people were finally removed from the comfortable function of my money. The penny dropped about another kind of power. My axe, cutting access, revoking proxy, changed the family's internal economy. They had been structurally reliant on someone saying yes. When I refused, their infrastructures faltered. They tried to blame me for their collapse. They framed me as selfish. But there's a difference between selfishness and self-preservation. I had used my resources to keep a system afloat that never acknowledged me. I started to find peace in small rituals. I cooked meals not for anyone else but for me. I planted herbs. I turned off the phone at night. I let the body that had been on call for years rest. It felt petty to feel pleasure in such ordinary things. But when you've been used as a bridge, small pleasures become the reclaimed territory of your life. There were commentators online and in the real world who asked if I regretted my action. I confessed I had one regret. Not that it happened, but that it took me so long. Why had I waited? Because there's a discipline to self-definition. You cannot be clear for others until you are clear for yourself. And yet the family kept spinning its narratives like web trap. The first holiday season without me arrived. Mom posted a curated image with the caption that read like a calm reproach. It was an attempt at emotional engineering. It did not say we're sorry. It said your absence hurts us. I felt the ache for Ellie, my niece whom I loved. And yet I recognized the weaponized tenderness. To reach out like that was to say we will use the child's image to bribe you. I contacted a lawyer once to confirm my steps had been done correctly. The night I filed the POA revocation. Legally I had no ties. Emotionally, people will always think they can make the same ties, but now they had to choose to make them without me supplying all the trust. That small separation was a new kind of discipline for me. I had to accept that sometimes the most dramatic change is letting people face the consequences of their own choices. However, life shy of family drama was not free from complexity. There are days when the absence is an ache like hunger, not the release of oxygen. Ellie's face comes in dreams sometimes, and I wonder if I did the right thing by pulling away entirely. Will she grow up with the lessons I'd wanted, Or will she only see a person who vanished when things got hard? Those are the stitches you carry privately. And still the slow rebound of my life, my new job, the small apartment with a fern on the sill. The routine has a secret power. The steadiness I'd always had the family used as a resource was now something I could invest in myself. I could finally be the person I'd been practicing to be when I was 19 and thought independence was a destination, not a state of mind. A few months later, a surprising message came that made me sit up in my chair. Joel, who had been stunned by the folder, reached out again. He was honest this time. He told me things he hadn't been able to say at the table when pride and scripts kept him quiet. He admitted he'd been complicit. He admitted he'd seen the receipt and lied to himself to keep the life he wanted. He apologized in that simple human way some people do when they finally want to shed a skin. I could take that as a victory, or I could take it as a puzzle piece. He asked to meet for coffee. I met him, and he thanked me. He said he should have noticed earlier. It wasn't enough to rebuild their marriage, and frankly I didn't want it to be. My role was not to repair two adults who had spent years ranging the world around a scapegoat. My role shifted into the thing it should have always been, deciding where to spend my capacity and whom to trust. In the months that followed, I was tested in small, telling ways. Bankers called. Mark called again, asking about options. My family attempted to seek help from other relatives and found out they'd burned other bridges when they made my exit. People sometimes forget that systems of entitlement are brittle. When a go-to collapses, the house quickly learns whether it was built on bricks or paper. I listened to messages. I read the notes my mother left. There were beguiling words, regret, sorrow, and the occasional self-justification. Yet for the first time, those words landed like leaves in a river rather than an anchor to my throat. I watched from a distance and let the river carry them. My own life bloomed in ways I'd undervalued. I met friends for dinner that didn't end with them asking for favors. I took a course in photography and learned to frame things differently. I started volunteering with a local shelter because I wanted to give without emotional strings attached. I fell into a kind of ordinary joy, the kind that has no metric and no audience. It was quiet but true. People will ask me if I regret the folder, if I regret the spectacle. The answer is simple. I regret the way I allowed myself to be used for so long. I do not regret showing them the ledger. I do not regret choosing myself over the nice lie. The ledger didn't have a punitive aim. It had an educative one. It showed them what they were doing. They could have learned. They didn't. I am not naive. I know family are messy and complex, and people aren't cartoons of villains and victims, but we are also responsible for where we invest our time and money and trust. There is a moral calculus that matters. If you are the one constantly giving and the only receipts appear in your own ledger, it is okay to set the pen down. Sometimes the most radical act of love is refusing to be complicit in your own humiliation. I chose to stop being everyone's emergency. I chose myself, and although my heart sometimes aches for the innocence of a child's Christmas, the ache is less like a wound now, and more like a scar. I examine when I need to remember. People have written to me online, telling me I was brave, telling me I had done the right thing. Strangers sometimes see you cleaner than your own blood, because they're not entangled with the scripts that sustain them. Still, strangers cannot fix what family refuses to fix. If you are reading this and suspect you are the family's secret ATM, take a breath. You are allowed to ask for contracts, for agreements, for reciprocity. You're allowed to say no. You are allowed to show the receipts. When the folder hit their hands, it didn't hurt me. It liberated me. They called me a monster that night. For them, I will always be the villain who broke an illusion. For me, I am the one who closed accounts and opened a life where I can sleep at night. If they ever change, if they ever understand, I would take them back differently, not as a bank but as a family. Not unconditionally, but with boundaries. But I will not hold my breath waiting for their lessons. I will breathe and live. And that is the only revenge I ever wanted, to be whole enough to keep living without them in the center of my ledger. I didn't make the folder out of spite. I made it like a scientist makes notes. Not to be theatrical, not because I wanted a courtroom, but because my memory had been the only ledger they trusted, and that system had failed me. The folder began on a rain-slicked Sunday night, with a mug of coffee that went cold and a playlist of songs that didn't require words to think about. I sat in a cramped kitchen that smelled like lemon cleaner and old paper, and I opened my laptop. Bank statements unrolled like a city skyline in numbers. Transfers that once felt small revealed patterns when they lined up in columns, check after check, transfer after transfer, always to the same few names. I printed everything. I printed dates and times, and little notations I'd scribbled in the margins of emails: urgent, please, emergency. The adjectives that were always designed to open me like a safe. There were moments where I expected a flood, shame, sorrow, a second guess that would make me start rescinding pages and apologize. Instead, the act of printing felt like cleaning a wound. The receipts were not accusations, they were facts. A friend told me a story once about the way lawyers use language like a scalpel. When I sat across from mine, an even-keeled woman named Sharon, who smelled faintly of eucalyptus and competence, I found comfort in the cadence of legal terms. I wanted clarity, not drama. She walked me through revoking power of attorney step by step. If they have joint accounts, she said, we'll freeze them. If there are access rights, we'll change them. Power of attorney is all about trust. You're simply rescinding that trust. There were forms to sign that felt final in their phrasing. I hereby revoke. It felt procedural and ceremonious. Sharon printed copies and explained the dominoes. Once the medical proxy was removed, the family would have to ask the court for guardianship if anything happened, not me. It was a boundary translated into law, something for which I'd been scolded my whole life. My inclination to make lists and keep receipts had transformed into a protective structure. We filed things carefully. I remember Sharon's voice steadying in the background as we notarized signatures and made certified copies. The clerk was kind but blunt. If they noticed and objected, it could get messy. Much of what we did was curiously mundane. There were stamps. There were office chairs that squeaked. There were Greek key patterns on the wallpaper. There was a finality in the sealed envelope we mailed to the court. I felt both lighter and astonishingly vulnerable. When I handed the lawyer a copy of the folder, she didn't blink. People forget the math of obligation sometimes, she said. You did the right thing by documenting. If this goes to court or if someone challenges it, you'll have a tidy record. My tidy record was not a courtroom weapon. It felt bureaucratic, like the way we file taxes to prevent the government from assuming we owe something we do not. The folder had become a mirror. It reflected what generosity had become in my family, a line item. There were small tactical moves they made after the folder. My mother texted a picture of Ellie with a cartoon heart on it. We miss you at holidays, it read. Another message later that evening. We're short on the mortgage. Any help? The voice of necessity returned rapidly. They strategized their approach in flavors I'd seen before. There was the soft approach, nostalgic photos and empty apologies. There was practical requests for money disguised as emergencies. Then there was social, trying to recruit other family members to pressure me into change. They did so because it is easier to make the person re-enter your economy than to change their own behaviors. I resisted. It was a complicated resistance. My heart reeled at Ellie's picture in a way that felt unfair. Children are not bargaining chips. But when the ask came with a passive-aggressive caption, when the picture of their half-decorated living room was followed by a line about the hole my absence made, I remembered the ask hiding under a blanket of guilt. It wasn't about wanting me. It was about getting the particular version of me that paid without speaking. People told me to go back, to accept a few calls, to make a payment. They told me family is family, and family forgives. Family also repeats patterns. It is not always loving in the way people mistake it for being. This is the hard part of loving, being honest about what you will offer, and what you will not. I started to rebuild. I found a therapist named Claire, who specialized in trauma that looks like codependency. Her office was painted in moss greens and neutrals. She made me make lists. She made me practice stopping myself from volunteering at the first ring of the phone. She taught me to parse asks into two questions. Is this love, and is this reciprocity? Sometimes the questions felt cruel. There are things you do for family out of care, and those things are not transactional, but there are also habits you maintain, because you are being spiritually taxed in ways that erode the border between generosity and servitude. Claire taught me to find the border, to keep it soft but present. She didn't give me moralizing lectures. She taught me to distinguish leverage from need. We role-played phone calls. It's ridiculous but effective. No, we can't help with that. I practiced until the phrase loosened in my mouth. Saying no was an act of training muscles I had underused. Joel's invitation to coffee felt like an odd punctuation. He didn't seem interested in reconciliation so much as an honest, embarrassed explanation. He met me at a small cafe that smelled like toasted almonds. He looked tired in a way that said responsibility had finally caught up with him. "Thanks for meeting me," he said, and I twirled a coffee cup because it made me less conspicuous. "You could have done this at the table," I said. He winced. "Yeah, I was blind. I didn't know how to see what was obvious in ledger form. I let my pride decide what questions I would ask. I believed the story, Heather," he corrected himself. "Natalie told me. I didn't want to think she was capable of it." There was a plainness in his words that felt true. People who are complicit often stagger under a mix of shame and self-preservation. Joel's shame was not about me. It was about his fear that his life story had been cobbled out of illusions. He asked for forgiveness in a way that wasn't asking me to carry him. He asked for truth and apology. "I'm glad you left," I blurted, and his eyebrows rose. "Not because I wanted you to fail, but because it proves the ledger wasn't just me being a jerk. It proved the pattern." My voice surprised me. I wasn't triumphant. I was tired and oddly content. The ledger had liberated more than me. It had liberated some people too. He thanked me. He said he'd started therapy and anonymous support meetings, and that he'd come to terms with the ways his loyalty had been weaponized. I said what I believed, that everyone has to choose their lives with their eyes wide open. That's not always easy, but it's necessary. We left with something that resembled peace. He promised to be honest with himself. I promised to keep my boundaries. It was not an offer to be friends, or a trick to pull him back into my economy. It was two adults deciding to step into integrity. Cousin Laura's apology came like a shy dawn. She sent me a voice message that was small and raw. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I clapped. "I'm sorry. You paid for my tuition, and I didn't even say thank you." We met at a park, the kind with a fountain and pigeons, who claimed dominion over breadcrumbs. She was younger than I'd remembered, wore a sweater 2 sizes too big, like she was trying to hide from the old scripts. She told me she'd been surprised when she saw the receipt. "I thought you were rich," she said, a statement both naive and somehow devastating. She meant it as a joke, but the undercurrent was real. People in the family had told themselves things to excuse their behavior. "I felt ashamed," she said. "Not just for the clapping, for thinking what I thought." She paused, The confession felt thin in the crisp air. I listened. I forgave her. Forgiveness is not a contract to return to what was. It's a recognition that complicity has different shapes, and that people can learn to hold themselves accountable. She asked what she could do. She wanted to refund money, to earn back whatever she thought her misstep had cost me. I stopped her. You can do something for someone who will need it, I said. Donate to something you care about. Volunteer. Learn to say no when it's not your job to fix everything. Her face brightened like someone relieved of a weight. She wasn't asking for absolution so much as a blueprint. That's what people in the family needed that night. A map to do better. I could provide directions now that I had left the role of silent rescuer. They sold the house in the spring. I watched the listings from my new apartment, the one with sagging hardwood floors and a sunlight patch that always hits the kitchen counter in the afternoon. There were pictures of the house dressed up, fresh paint, staged sofas, a yard like a postcard. The listing agent used hashtags in the copy and talked about character. Character, I thought, a lovely word for the architecture that survived years of messy human behavior. The sale closed with the sort of paperwork that was anticlimactic in its formality. I felt oddly neutral. There was no gloat in me as the title changed hands. The real sale had happened earlier that winter. The sale of my willingness to be a bank. The house could be another family's dream now. It could be another person's misery. My responsibility had been severed, and with it went an old ache. I made a ritual of clearing out my old voicemail. I deleted the messages that begged and those that shamed. I kept a message or two from years ago that still smelled like love, because not everything that family does is a debt. There were good things in it too, and I kept those with a small guarded gratitude. One afternoon at a volunteer shift at the shelter, I saw Ellie's face in a little girl who liked crayons. I felt that old tug. And then something else, a recognition that love does not have to look like martyrdom. I could love my niece from a distance that was healthy. Distance is not absent. It's breathable space where love can survive without turning into resentment. There's a misperception that liberation is dramatic. People imagine movie montages and victory songs. The real work was quieter. It was in picking up the phone when a friend asked if I wanted to eat pizza. It was in going to the dentist because I had no one else to rely on. It was in sending a text to say hi without a price tag attached. It was in learning to say no and then not feeling a compulsion to make up for the no by doing other things. Human beings are social creatures. We want belonging. The trick is not to mistake belonging for an identity that costs you everything. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is create limits. Limits were not punitive, as some of them insisted. They were protective. Work was a balm. I took a job that required focus and produced results that had nothing to do with moral accounting. My boss praised me for making deadlines and not for holding family together. Coworkers asked me to lunch and did not follow the invitation with a plea for cash. Those were small privileges that had felt exotic before. I savored them. In the quiet moments, I thought of Natalie. I wondered what would become of someone who learned how to perform the world for applause. Would she ever feel satisfied without the adrenaline of someone else covering for her? Would she ever learn to ask with honesty, not with manipulation? I did not know. My archive of receipts could not teach people how to be better. It simply made the pattern visible. I also thought of my parents. I thought of my father's inclination toward ease. I thought of my mother's desire to have order. They were not monsters. They had been small in the ways that hurt. Sometimes smallness is a practice. Sometimes it is a habit. They had not grown into larger human beings overnight, but I had stepped out of their orbit in a way that created a new emotional physics. There were times when I felt regret, Not because I had done justice to them, but because I missed certain rituals. A holiday dinner that was messy but warm. A laugh shared over dessert. Letting go doesn't mean erasing the good. It means refusing to let the good be consumed by the bad. 6 months after the folder, a message arrived that felt different. It wasn't a plea disguised as an apology. It was my mother's voice, honest and small. "We have been talking," she wrote. "We saw what we did. It wasn't right. We are getting help. Natalie is in therapy. Joel left. Ellie is safe. We are learning to ask differently. We miss you. No pressure. When you are ready, we would like to try a conversation." Sometimes reconciliation begins with a sentence like that. Unassuming, not demanding. I read it, and felt something like a gust of wind through an attic window. The space it opened was delicate. I didn't rush. I called Claire and ran through my feelings. She recommended a slow timeline, a few messages to gauge sincerity, then a phone call, then perhaps a mediated meeting. There was no rush. I responded with a small text. "I see it. That's good. I'm doing well." Nothing more. That reply was a soft scaffolding. It let me see their intentions without giving them access to me again. They responded with gratitude. There was no urgent ask. It was the first time in months that the conversation felt like a real conversation, and not attacked. Months later we met in a neutral place. A small community center with folding chairs and a kettle that always had tea. My mother's hands trembled as she put her cup down. Natalie sat with a different posture, less performative, more exposed. Joel wasn't there. He'd chosen to keep his distance, and I respected that. Bringing him would have been too much. The conversation was strange at first. Awkward apologies and rehearsed attempts at sincerity. We messed up, my mother said. Not because we were bad people, but because we were lazy about asking for help. We took what you gave for granted. There are people who will argue that language like that is still palliative, that the goal is to make the wounded forget the hurt. I didn't expect absolution. It would have been naive. I wanted to hear more than the script. I wanted to see evidence of change. Natalie's eyes met mine, and for the first time without theatrics, she said, "I am sorry for how I treated you. I was selfish. I am working on it." I felt something unclench in me, not forgiveness in full, not a reconciliation written in the stars, just something that sounded like the beginning of a map. We agreed on a few things. Transparency about finances moving forward, a plan for Ellie that did not weaponize contact, and a timeline for checking in that did not turn into a bill collector's call. We established boundaries that felt they were not the dramatic, punitive things I had once feared imposing. They were practical rules to protect all of us. We did not agree to be best friends. We agreed to treat each other like adults, who share the same history but not the same obligation. Walking out of that center felt like stepping out of a fog. The changes were incremental. The real test wasn't the meeting. It was the months after, when they practiced being accountable without me propping them up. The measure of growth is in the small acts that do not get noticed by anyone but the person they affect. A year later, the house sold. The trust rebalanced, and my life felt fuller. Ellie sent me a drawing of a blue dog. I saved it in a drawer. I called once a month on Sunday afternoons and asked about school projects and whether she liked math. We texted pictures of silly hats. Everything moved at a leisurely temperature. I was free to love in a way that didn't leave me raw. My parents did not become saints overnight. They still found comfort in old patterns. But small changes accrued. When my mother had a medical scare, she called me without theatrics, but in genuine fear. I answered with the same calm I'd hoped to receive when I'd sent my first help years ago. That conversation felt different, because it had less baggage. It was not about access. It was about mutual care. I look back and think about that night at the table often. There is a line in the ledger that reads like a ledger often does: clean, numerical, sterile. $78,000 is a number, but the real ledger was the emotional one that had accrued in the years, the smells of exhaustion, the late-night guilt, the small betrayals that compound. I can list the receipts and the debits. I can also remember what it cost me to display them. If you are someone who carries the greatest share of emotional labor in your family, understand this: people will tell you you are being dramatic when you finally defend your peace. They will call you cold and mean. They will weaponize the narrative of family against you because it is an easy tool. But family is not a synonym for control. It's a space for mutual care, and mutual care cannot be one-sided without costing one person everything. I am doing well. Not perfect. Not undefeated. I cry sometimes at movies that remind me of meals I never got to fix, or at the idea of a niece who may grow up thinking money and love are the same. But I also breathe without the anxiety of a phone call, and I sleep without an anticipatory guilt. The folder was a moment, dramatic maybe, but a necessary one. It was not a revenge spectacle. It was an act of accounting. It was me learning that boundaries are not betrayal. They are a kind of love, because they create space in which relationships cannot both thrive and be parasitic. Months beyond the folder, strangers online sometimes asked if I had any regrets. My regret was simple. I wished I'd caught the pattern sooner. I wished I'd asked for reciprocity before it became a crisis. The best advice I can offer, distilled from the therapy sessions and the nights at the lake and the courthouse forms, is this: document. Keep records. Not because you plan to attack anyone, but because you owe yourself an accurate memory. It makes patterns visible. Set boundaries. Start small. Practice refusing in a way that is kind but firm. You don't need to be cruel to be clear. Seek counsel. A lawyer will tell you the legal steps. A therapist will tell you how to sit with the discomfort of saying no. Both are useful. One protects your rights and the other protects your heart. Accept imperfection. People will not always change on command. They may not change at all. That is on them, not you. Rebuild quietly. Liberation often looks like boring things: dental appointments, steady sleep, a new hobby. Those mundane things are the architecture of peace. When I think about the scene at the table, the scream, the folder, the flight into night air, I feel a strange affection for the person I was then: patient, practiced, and finally brave enough to print the receipts. Courage is not always the dramatic act. It is often a quiet decision made in the kitchen, as coffee gets cold. If you want an ending, this is it. I kept the folder as a record, and then I retired it. I archived it in a drawer with a label that reads, "Not for sale." The practical part of me likes that the facts exist if needed, and the sentimental part of me likes that I no longer need to wave them around as proof of life. A year later I got another letter from my mother. It read, simply, "We are trying." That line is small, imperfect, and intermittently true. Growth is messy. It unravels and knits in odd cycles, but I could see it this time, and that's enough for me to keep the door on a hinge that opens slowly. I am not a hero. I am not a villain. I am a person who finally regarded himself as someone worth protecting. In the end, that was the only thing I ever needed to do. If you are reading this and your hand is trembling over the phone because someone you love is asking you for something that costs you everything, may you have the courage to print your own receipt. May you find a lawyer who will stamp your name on paper, and a therapist who will help you practice saying no. May you sleep again, because the quiet revenge, the only one worth having, is the revocation of a life spent for other people's illusion. The revenge is living well, unbent and whole, and perhaps teaching the people who would have exploited you that real dignity is not free. Thanks for watching. I'm still here, and I'm still learning how to be kind to myself.